every time you put someone in prison, you reduce the likelihood of them ever having a law-abiding life by 90%.
Do you think that there could be another lockdown in future?
If you have been in care, you're 15 times more likely to go to prison.
That's crazy.
Than everybody else on average who hasn't been in care. You know, the Misuse of Drugs Act came into force in the early 1970s. Before that, you could get heroin on prescription, you could even get cocaine on prescription.
One of the things that just totally confused me was that, because I've done my fair share of time, and somebody that would come in for, let's say, drugs or some sort of, like a minor violent crime, they would get something silly like 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 years, but then someone comes in for like paedophilia, or comes in for something, them sort of crimes, they would get something like a year or 2.
Organised crime are not there to get people off drugs, they're there to sell as much product as they can,
money, right?
To make as much profit as possible.
I was coming on to that. That was going to be my next question about, do you think drugs, cannabis, cocaine should be legalised? See, one of the biggest things that people don't do is think. So this is another skill altogether. It's not thinking of ways to make money. You got to think, what am I doing with the money I'm making right now? Welcome back to my channel where we discuss property, business, lifestyle and well-being. If this is the first time you are visiting my channel, then please hit the like and subscribe button. Today we have a really interesting guest. His name is Chris Daw. Now, Chris Daw is a criminal KC. A KC stands for King's Counsel. He represents big cases in court. He's also a big supporter for the justice system being really flawed, and he has a book out called Justice on Trial. I can't wait to speak with him today. Yeah. So what's your morning routine like? How do you start?
Morning routine?
Yeah.
My morning routine it's never quite the same. It just depends what I'm doing that day. So okay. I don't have a routine in the sense of, but partly because I'm not always, like every week's different. I'll be in a different place every week. Yeah. I'll sometimes I'm working from home. And then I do have a kind of a routine then, which is to go in the gym first thing, go on the exercise bike, do some emails on the exercise bike.
Yeah.
And then kind of that helps me clear like the most urgent emails off while I'm actually doing some exercise.
Really?
So everything's
all at home, right?
All efficiency. Yeah, in the gym at home.
Yeah.
And then I've got lucky enough to have a pool at home, and I'll go for a little dip. Kind of like, well, that will really refresh me. And then,
have you got a sauna steam room as well?
Sauna steam room, yeah, the whole thing. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I've got the whole thing set up at home. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Okay.
But that I tend to go in there like first thing in the morning, and then I come out, I've had an exercise, and then I'll have some breakfast, and then if I'm working at home, it's usually a full-on mixture of like working on cases, doing Zoom calls and client calls, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Emails obviously all the time, like everybody. And then it's every day is totally different. So that's the great thing about my job is like.
Do you work 7 days a week or Monday to Friday?
No, I work when I need to work. So sometimes it's 7 days a week. If I'm in the middle of a trial, it's nearly always 7 days a week.
Really?
Yeah, because when you're in court in a trial, I'm in court all day. So I'm kind of doing just the most urgent stuff to get ready for the day. Then I'm in court all day. Then I'm maybe spending some time with my client, going through what's happened and talking about stuff during the day and the rest of the team. And so then it's kind of usually about 6 o'clock before that's finished. And then I've only been working on one case during that day, when actually I've got, at any one time I could have up to 20 different cases that are running at different stages.
Yep.
So I'm constantly having to advise. Like I say, when I leave here, I'm going to drive to London, but I'll be making.
So who do you speak to? Like your junior?
No, it depends. Yeah, I have junior barristers who work on cases for me.
Yeah.
And with me, I have usually solicitors or sometimes a big team of solicitors that are working on the case. Obviously, my client as well.
Yeah.
Which might or might not be a company or an individual. Depends on what kind of case it is. So it's just a question of making best use of the time. Because if I didn't use the time, for example, when I'm in the car, then those calls have got to go into tomorrow. So
True.
That's kind of,
you might as well just
get them done
rolling.
today.
Yeah.
So
interesting. So you're a KC, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for those that don't know what KC is, I mean, how would you describe a
Well,
KC?
I'm a barrister. I'm trained and qualified as a barrister.
Yeah.
And then a KC, used to be called a QC before the Queen passed away. it stands for King's Counsel, and it's the very kind of elite level of being a barrister. Effectively, it's the top sort of 10%, if you like, of all barristers who ever get to become.
How many KCs do you think they are in UK?
In the country, about 1,000 or so. Who are
Really,
actually
that
practicing.
is a very small number, right?
It's a small number. So yeah, altogether, I think there are getting on for 20,000 barristers now in total. So it may be slightly more than 1,000, but the number is smaller than it used to be. There used to be a larger number because more people used to apply, but now it's quite expensive just to apply. Apply, yeah, it's thousands and thousands just to go through the application process.
Wow, okay.
And most people don't succeed. So, people, unless you're pretty certain that you're going to get it, a lot of people now are not bothering to apply.
So what do you have to do to succeed to become a KC?
So you have to demonstrate. So there's an application form which is 65 pages long.
Okay.
And you have to basically set out details of up to 12 cases that you've done in the past 2 or 3 years,
Yep.
which are absolutely massive cases, really, really complicated, really difficult cases. And you have to put down a list of 12 judges who will give you a reference and 12 lawyers who will give you a reference. There's 24 people who you have to actually put down as references.
Okay.
And all of them have to not all of them will be approached, but the ones who are asked out of the 24 will have to say whether they think you're good enough or not, and why.
Wow. So you have to get a reference from all of them as part of this application?
Well, you don't get a reference, you have to name 24, and then it's up to the appointments people who they contact. So they don't contact all 24, but you have to make sure that all the 24 that you put down, if they are asked, that you hope they're going to say the right things, which is basically they have to say that this person is suitable to be a QC or KC, and basically reaches the standard of excellence which is required.
Yeah, so if you upset anyone along the way, then...
It can be a problem, yeah, it can be a problem. Although you'd be wise not to put them down on your form.
Yeah, that's true as well,
That was the case.
So currently, how many cases have you got going on like at any one time?
Well, as I said, I think up to about 20, but that will include quite small cases where I'm maybe just giving advice on one issue to do with a particular transaction, for example, or a particular, for example, I advise companies about how they can comply with the law over money laundering or something like that. So I might be asked for advice about a very specific kind of issue. So that might be one case. But on the other side of the kind of the other end of the scale, I have cases that are going to be in court for a year. So I have a case at the moment, a political corruption case, where there are going to be 2 trials which will last almost a year.
Is this a UK case or
this is a UK case?
Right, okay.
Yeah. And so that sort of case is, that will be at one end of the spectrum in terms of how much work and how much time it will take me to deal with the case.
Yeah.
Others might be just a few meetings, maybe some written advice. But at any one time, I've got to keep in my head about 20 different cases with different clients, different issues. Different teams, different legal teams in each case, because I generally, although there are lots of lawyers that I work with together on teams regularly, and some of those cases might be the same team, I also work with lots of firms of solicitors, lots of different junior barristers. So, I'm also working with different teams. So I'm kind of managing litigation across a wide variety of different cases and a wide variety of different teams.
Interesting. So let's just say you've got a trial going on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
When do you start focusing on that case specifically?
My way of working is that I look at every case as beginning on the day I'm instructed and finishing on the day the case ends. So I've had cases that have lasted for 7 years. So I've been instructed, let's say, at the beginning of that period, and the case has not actually finished in court for another 6 or 7 years. But I have to think about and manage the process from the beginning to the end. I suppose it's a bit like if you're, in your line of work, if you're in property development or you're looking, there's different things that have to be done at different times.
Got it.
So to answer your question, you're not looking to, I'm not looking to prepare the case for trial on day one, any more than you're looking to have everything on site for a building on day one. Things need to be planned at different stages. When it gets to for a 2-week trial, which actually for me is quite a short trial, most of my trials last for several months.
Yeah.
But for a 2-week trial, I'd probably be looking to spend at least 2 full weeks before that working on it full time.
Yeah.
But
so
over the year or 2
it.
before that period, I'll have spent many days with the client, many days with the team, many hours reading the evidence and preparing along the way. But the absolutely really intense focus comes in the weeks and months. In a long trial, it might be a month or 2 of preparation. In a shorter trial, a week or 2. It depends on how long the trial is.
So you only have private clients, right? You have big clients that you work with. But let's just say that somebody who's in the criminals, like who's in jail right now and they're facing some sort of jail time or they're charged up. They obviously haven't got the ability to pay for someone private, right? Because it's a lot of money. So they're going to be going down a legal aid route.
Yeah.
and we all know legal aid are not really, it's not really they don't pay well.
No.
So how are the barristers up there dealing with cases? Like, are they kind of are they giving 100%, do you think, from what you've seen, or?
Yeah, I mean, I for the first sort of half of my career, I did lots of legal aid cases. All criminal lawyers kind of start out in legal aid. It's because that's where most of the work is. You know, most people don't have the money to pay expensive lawyers for themselves. But to answer your question directly, my experience is that those who are doing legal aid work now, it's a very different world to when I started because it's so badly paid now compared to then. But those who are doing that kind of work now are really doing the best they can within the limits of what's available to pay for it.
Got it.
So the problem with legal aid, because each case pays very little compared to private cases and private clients, is that in order to make a living, lawyers have to do lots more cases. So if you think about it, you know, again, it's the same principle. You know, if you've got a construction business and you've got to build 10 houses, well, if you've only got the same money as someone else has got to build one house, it's a very different project. It's a very different job. And so legal aid lawyers tend to, through no fault of their own, are spread quite thin. So that's not to say that they're not putting 100% into the case. It's just that they're not putting 100% of their time into the case. Because they can't, they just physically can't do that because they don't have enough time in the day.
So what does an average barrister get paid for a case? How does it work?
It depends. So if you're talking about legal aid cases, you know, some cases the barrister might only get paid a few £100 or a couple of thousand. Yeah, absolutely. The fees are really not that high. Even for trials, it can be £2,000 or £3,000 for actually going to Crown Court. That means going to see the client first, maybe in custody, once, twice, 3 times. All the reading and the preparation, everything. So the amounts of money that people make per case can be very small.
That's not a lot
in
of money.
legal aid. It's not a lot of money. I mean, there was a statistic that came out there was a recent strike of criminal barristers who went on strike last year, legal aid barristers. And some of those barristers are earning, you know, the younger barristers are earning less than the minimum wage when you take away all the overheads and the expenses that goes with it.
Wow.
So that's what's happened. The system's cut to the bone. Now, once you go up a bit in terms of more serious and more complicated cases, then, you know, there are legal aid barristers who do earn, you know, 100 grand a year, you know, that you can earn that. But it's got to be, you know, that will be working flat out and really like absolutely kind of, and that's slightly confusing because the 100,000 is fees, gross fees. Out of that, there's travel expenses, there's office expenses, because all barristers are self-employed.
Yeah.
So they've all got their own expenses. They've all got to pay for everything out of their money before they start to actually have any income. And then, of course, they've got to pay tax. So really, on the legal aid side of the profession, there's really not much money in it.
Wow.
Once you go onto the private side, then the sky's the limit, like it is with any private business. You know, if I have a very ultra high net worth client or a corporate client with very deep pockets, then the fees are very, very high, and they can run to millions of pounds for one case.
That's interesting. So I'm, for example, in properties, and for me, like, the end goal is development, because you want to be at where the big boys are. So surely, if somebody's listening and they're just starting off and becoming a barrister, you're in a position now where, you know, you're working with private clients. What's the game? What advice would you give to them?
Well, I think the way that you develop your practice is probably not dissimilar to any business, which is, first of all, you've got to be really good at what you do. You've got to absolutely nail the case. So if you keep going talking about houses, but if your build quality is not good, then people are not going to come back to you for property or for development and stuff like that. So it's the small details, just making sure that you really do an amazing job. The second thing I think is what I would call client care. So that's, it's one thing to do the job, but it's also making sure you understand what the client wants from you.
Service,
right?
So
some clients want lots of contact, and they want to be texting, ringing, emailing. They want to constantly be kind of like fed with information or to ask questions. Other clients want the opposite. They don't want that. They want you to get on with it and only contact them when you need something from them. So you have to understand each client and deal with each client in the way that they want to be dealt with, as opposed to the way you as a lawyer or a service provider, as I would call it, want to deal with it. So
I think that's really good advice, and I think that applies to everything in life, right?
Of course it does.
Understand the customer, what they want.
Yeah,
instead
absolutely.
Of giving them what you think they want, right?
Absolutely. And the final thing I think is that you have to, often perhaps barristers more than most people are not that good at kind of marketing themselves, actually showing people what you've done. And so, whether that be through stuff that's within a professional network or social media or media interviews, which I do quite a lot of media stuff. I think, the truth is, however good you are at doing the job and however good you are at dealing with individual clients, You know, if nobody out there can kind of see you in the shop window, so to speak, then it's going to restrict the number of people that will ever come to you.
Nobody knows you, right?
So putting yourself about, making sure people know who you are and what you do. But ultimately, I think the most important thing of all is to just be really, really good at your job. If you're really good at what you do, then you know, one way or another, success will follow from that. And certainly that's the way it was for me. I just worked really hard. And I think I impressed a lot of clients early on in my career, and then word of mouth went round. And
that's it, yeah.
You know, and it came to the point, and I'm in the fortunate position now where I have to turn cases away because I don't have enough time.
You're in that position. That's what happens to everyone, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think of the current legal system at the moment?
Well, I think the legal system is it's an excellent system in principle. So that we have a really fair system in England.
Yeah.
The legal system, of course, covers a multitude of different issues, everything from, you know, commercial disputes to divorce and family law to, you know, personal injury and accidents and criminal law, which is where I kind of practice. And I think probably of all of those systems, the one that's the most broken is the criminal justice system.
Really?
Yeah, I think so, because vast underfunding over a long period of time has been a major issue. So we've seen big cuts in policing and big cuts in, you know, prison officers' numbers, and across the piece, probation, everywhere in the system we've seen these enormous cuts in numbers, courts shutting, courts court staff numbers reducing. So we've seen that just basic kind of lack of resource, lack of investment over many, many decades, not just in recent years. So that's been a major problem. But on the other side of the coin is that we, as a country, I think, are just obsessed with the idea that the criminal justice system can solve crime, can solve all these problems. So we have this idea that if we just keep increasing the number of people we put in prison, and if we imprison them for even longer, that's going to achieve some net benefit. And the problem is, the truth is it doesn't, and it hasn't. And if you want any better example of that, you only have to look across the Atlantic at the United States, where they have 2.5 million people in prison. And we have about 80,000 in Britain.
What's the population though in America? 300
million. So the population's about 5 times bigger than ours.
Right.
But their prison population is something like 40 times bigger than ours.
Yeah.
So if you just think that through, 30 times bigger than ours. But so vastly greater, even on a pro rata or proportionate basis. And most people, I suspect, who are either watching or listening to this will be thinking to themselves, well, I don't think America's got the lowest crime rate on earth, and I don't think it's the safest place on earth. Certainly if you've ever been to any of their major cities, you wouldn't think that, and you'd know from the murder rates that they have one of the highest rates of violent crime on the planet. And yet they have followed a pattern that we are following in Britain, which is just to constantly increase the use of prison in response to every single kind of case. There's a high-profile case, so we need to lock people up for longer and longer and longer. And the truth of it is that the longer people are locked up for, the less likely they'll ever come out and do something useful.
Where do you think that thought process comes from then?
Well, I talk about this, I've written a book about this, but and I've talked about this in the book. Where it comes from actually is very ancient. It goes back to biblical times. It goes back beyond biblical times. So the idea of, you know, an eye for an eye and kind of punishing people who have done wrong in the past with the death penalty, nowadays that's kind of been replaced largely with very long prison sentences, life without parole, you know, whole life sentences, that kind of thing, which has become more common in recent years. All of that goes back to kind of fairly ancient ideas about punishment for doing things that are considered to be a moral sin. So that mentality may have worked. I don't know whether it worked 5,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or even back in the medieval times in Britain. But I can tell you one thing, it doesn't work today. It doesn't work in today's complex modern society where, you know, there are a whole range of reasons why crime takes place. Most of them can't be cured by long prison sentences. And most of those who are in prison can't be cured, if that's the right word, by being kept there for longer. And one of the reasons for that is because prisons just don't achieve the primary objective, it seems to me, for the whole criminal justice system should be a very simple one: reduce crime. Reduce the number of crimes, reduce the amount of violence in society, reduce the amount of, you know, drug overdose, for example, and other kind of byproducts of crime, reduce the amount of crime that's committed by people who are addicted to drugs. You know, that's a huge problem in many, many communities where much of the street crime and burglary is driven by the drug trade. Much of the violence is driven by the drug trade. And our system simply doesn't recognise that it's failing to address those problems, and we're making it worse. Every time you put someone in prison, you reduce the likelihood of them ever having a law-abiding life by 90%.
Yeah.
And that to me seems so obvious, and yet it's something we can't get away from, because in politics, there's nothing that runs better with the electorate at election time than we're going to increase sentences for criminals. We're going to give people more time in jail. It works, it gets votes, it gets people elected. So they keep on doing it, even though in fact it doesn't work in practice, and those policies make things worse.
Yeah, well, one of the things that just totally confused me was that, because I've done my fair share of time, and somebody that would come in for, let's say, drugs or some sort of, like a minor violent crime, they would get something silly like 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 years. But then someone who comes in for like paedophilia, or comes in for rape, or comes in for something, them sort of crimes, or robbing an old woman's handbag or something, they would get something like a year or two.
Well, it's unlikely, to be honest. I mean, there are rare examples, but it'd be unlikely that someone would get a year or two for rape these days. Sentences have gone up, but you're right to point out that often
they would get less, though.
They might do. It depends on the nature of the case. I mean, to me, the massive over-sentencing we've seen has mostly been in the area of drug trafficking. So as you'll have come across, there are lots of people now in our prison system doing 15, 20, 25-year sentences for drugs conspiracies, or even longer in some cases. I find it hard to square the circle in the way that you've effectively just outlined, which is, how can it be 25 years for supplying drugs that people have chosen or want to take themselves, but only 5 years for rape or child abuse? I can't work that out, and I don't think that's right.
Yeah, and where do you think that comes from then?
Well, it comes again from the false belief, that the war on drugs can be won by just locking up more people for
long
longer.
sentences. Yeah,
that's been the prevailing sort of wind. So when I started out in the 90s, if you got 10 years on a drugs case, that was a big sentence. Now, 20 years is not even a big sentence after a trial, and as I say, there are lots of people doing 25s, 28s, 30s who have gone to trial on drugs cases. And I just think over the years, the government and policymakers and those who decide on sentence levels have just been fooled into thinking that it's somehow going to solve the drug problem in society. And the Misuse of Drugs Act came into force in the early 1970s. Before that, you could get heroin on prescription. You could even get cocaine on prescription. And there were very few heroin addicts in Britain. There were about 1,000 or so.
Just because it was
available. It was available, but it was only available on prescription, and it was you had access to medical care and support if you were a heroin addict. But within 10 years or so of the Misuse of Drugs Act coming into force, where the entire heroin supply chain was criminalised, all heroin was supplied on the black market, and we had hundreds of thousands, and still do have hundreds of thousands of people addicted to heroin.
Yeah.
And just because we criminalised it, because the minute you criminalise drugs, you put the supply chain into the hands of organised crime, and organised crime are not there to get people off drugs. They're there to sell as much product as they can,
money, right?
To make as much profit as possible.
I was coming on to that. That was going to be my next question about what do you think drugs, cannabis, cocaine should be legalised?
I do, but not quite in the way that perhaps most people might understand that. So the assumption when you say I'm in favour of legalising heroin or cocaine is that it'd be a free-for-all, then that you could just sell, anyone could sell them.
Yeah.
Of course that's not the case, any more than it's the case for alcohol. Not anybody's allowed to sell or make alcohol. You have to have a licence to do that. And for me, I think I would be in favour of licensing the drug supply chain so that you could apply for a licence, or possibly even that everything was just supplied through government licensed premises, through licensed dispensaries that possibly would be run directly by the government. And the aim would not be to make as much profit and sell as many drugs as possible. The aim would be to keep users safe and keep the public safe. And I saw this in action in Switzerland, for example.
I was going to say, what country has it been successful?
So no one's actually gone as far as I'm advocating in terms of legalising and licensing the whole drug supply chain. But a lot of countries, Portugal being one of them, Canada more recently, there's an experiment in Vancouver, they're talking about effectively decriminalising all drugs for sort of personal use quantities. But Switzerland's probably gone the furthest in terms of heroin. So as you probably know, heroin is one of the big problem drugs on the streets in terms of the health of addicts, but also how they need to get money to buy the drugs, and how people will kill each other for the territory, to control the heroin trade. Well, in Switzerland, they had all of those problems back in the 80s, and they had huge numbers of overdoses. They had people injecting heroin in parks and children's playgrounds and public places. They had a massive heroin problem. So instead of kind of cracking down on it, which is instinctively what we would probably do in England and have done in England. What they did instead was gradually over time have introduced, in effect, free heroin for heroin addicts. So heroin addicts in Switzerland can go along to a clinic in the morning. They can inject, or they can take the heroin in, supervised by nurses and medical staff to make sure they don't overdose and nothing goes wrong, and they have clean needles, and they have access to sort of healthcare and other health advice. And they come back again in the afternoon or the evening after they've been to college or work, and they're given more heroin. And heroin, people may be surprised to know, is very cheap to produce. It's actually a very cheap drug. If you were to go out to some of the more wild mountains of, Pakistan, you could go and buy a kilo of heroin for $1,000 US. On the streets of Britain, that will be many times that amount by the time it's been, cut and stamped on, as they call it, and all the rest of it. It will be several tens of thousands of pounds for the same quantity. And so if the government was, as happens in Switzerland, supplies pharmaceutical heroin, it's actually very, very cheap. It costs something like £10 a day to keep someone on pharmaceutical heroin, as opposed to possibly 100, 200, even more, depending on how much heroin they buy on the streets. So it doesn't cost the country very much to provide the heroin. But what the end result of that is that those users don't commit crime. They don't have to go into sex work, as often happens for particularly female heroin users in Britain, and they certainly don't go around burgling their neighbours' houses. And actually, they don't overdose either, which I think is really important, because a number of people overdosing in this country, in certain sort of hotspots like Glasgow in particular, very, very high numbers of people overdosing on heroin for one reason or another. And I think that if we were to focus on getting rid of the worst parts of the drug trade, which are the violence around it, the crime that's around it to buy the drugs, and perhaps worst of all, the deaths of so many people from addiction and from just injecting either too much or the wrong thing. I think we'd move things along a lot more if we were to follow some of those other ways of doing things, which have just been so successful. They have almost no overdoses in the major cities of Switzerland, whereas we have thousands a year in Britain, and America has hundreds of thousands of drug deaths a year. So the systems that we're sort of copying are mainly around the American model, where we should be looking more towards the European model, which is much more humane and ultimately more successful because it reduces crime.
What sort of support are you getting from your other fellow
Quite a
barristers?
lot, I would say. I would say that most people who work in the criminal justice system, even on the policing side, so very senior police officers and people at the top end of policing, I think most of those people would view my ideas as actually being sensible, and the policies that I'm suggesting as being sensible. But at the same time, most of them would say politically, getting it through the political process is the hard part, and getting it through the public. Because most people, if you went around the streets of Manchester out here and said, should we legalise heroin? People would say, no, that's crazy.
They'll say
crazy?
no,
But they're saying no because it's a gut instinct, not necessarily because
they've not thought about
they
it, right?
haven't thought it through, and they haven't necessarily realised that the consequence of criminalisation is most of the crime that surrounds drugs.
Right, so you've got a book out, right? What was your reason for the book, and what was your main few points to bring this book out?
Well, it's interesting. So the book's called Justice on Trial, and it's available from Amazon and all the other places that you can buy books from. And it's interesting you asked that question just after we've been talking about drugs, because I actually wrote an article about legalisation of drugs for The Spectator about 4 years ago. And it was out of that I received an email from Bloomsbury, one of the big publishing houses, who said, we've seen your article in The Spectator about legalising drugs. We're really interested. It's quite a radical idea. We're interested in coming to see you and talk about a book. So I hadn't actually thought about writing a book until that point. We had a meeting and they were like, well, what do you think about some of the other things to do with our sort of criminal process? So drugs is one, what else? And I started talking about some of my ideas about prisons and how ineffective they were, and indeed how counterproductive they are in making crime worse rather than better. So we have drug policy where we make things worse. We have prison policy where we make things worse. And then finally, the kind of main strand was, or one of the other three main strands was around children, and the way that we still criminalise children in our country, and particularly those who have been through the care system or are going through the care system, And so they get double whammied. Not only are they in care, which must be hard enough, for a child to kind of cope with, not having a sort of family environment, but also they are they're, at the same time they're being they're being criminalised, arrested, and locked up, and then the sort of revolving door starts for many of those youngsters at a very young age. From even some of them as young as 10 are being arrested, but certainly sort of by 12 and 13 or 14, there are youngsters who are being arrested regularly, who end up in the youth courts, and even before their 16th birthday, they're in young offenders institutions, which basically just prison for kids. So that was the third area. So those three things, it seemed to me: drug prohibition, overuse of prison, and the criminalisation of children. If you were to address those three things, my strong belief is that you'd halve the amount of crime in society, you'd halve the amount of, the number of victims and the amount of damage that's done to people in society, but also, crucially, you'd halve the cost of it all. Because the cost of keeping people in prison is astronomical. It costs something like $50,000 a year to keep someone in prison for a year. That's much less than it costs to go to Eton or one of the top public schools in the country.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to understand. We're spending all this money to keep people locked up, to make them, in most cases, you're one of the rare exceptions, but in most cases to make them more criminal than they were before they went in. And yet, we won't spend the money on education and supporting young people in the same way. And if we did, if we were to support those kids in care with anything like the amount of money we spend on the prison system, then I suspect most of those kids in care would come through it with a different outcome.
What do you think of the care system? Is it all messed up? Do you think it is?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most dysfunctional parts of our public sector, and it's probably not as talked about as much as it should be.
Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
I think it's uncomfortable. I think it's uncomfortable, the idea of children not having parents and not having a family environment to live in. I think for most people who've not been through that, that's quite hard to kind of get your head around. I know lots of people have unhappy home lives and unhappy family lives for one reason or another, but I don't think most of us can imagine growing up without parents at all, like literally being looked after in a home, or with a succession of foster parents, maybe for a year or two here or a year or two there. So I think there's a discomfort that people probably feel about the whole idea of children being kind of separated out from the norm, if you like, of family life. But I think mainly it's just not very. It's not a political priority. So unless if something's not a priority for sort of the public generally, then politicians won't focus on it. And unless politicians focus on something around election time and between election time, then nothing gets done about it. So I think it's a sort of almost it's like a dirty secret almost that we have this dysfunctional system for some of the most vulnerable people in our country, i.e. children in care. It's something that is little talked about, sadly, and I don't think there's probably an understanding of just how catastrophic the outcomes are for most of the kids in care.
Yeah.
There's a sort of statistic that absolutely shocked me, which was that if you have been in care, you're 15 times more likely to go to prison.
That's crazy.
Than everybody else on average who hasn't been in care. Now, I don't think anybody would suggest that because just by the sheer chance that you happen to be in care that you're 15 times more criminal to start with. It's that the care system is somehow so flawed and fails those children so badly that so many of them end up being arrested and ultimately put in prison. And of course, sadly, many of them end up with addictions and many of them end up with significant mental health problems because being in care must be about as traumatic as life gets for a child. You can't really imagine. I mean, I can't imagine, I was lucky enough to have parents who were incredibly loving and caring and supportive of everything kind of that I did, and were there as you'd hope as that safety net, in your life, which is what your kind of parents are ultimately there for, is to be that safety net where you can make mistakes and they're there to pick you up and support you. Children in care don't have that. If they fall out and they have a fight with someone, then they're going to be in big trouble. Whereas in a family environment, kids fall out, they have fights sometimes, and things happen, and that's part of life. And as a family, good parents will help navigate that journey, and your kids will come away hopefully on the whole without kind of being too traumatized. Whereas I think care must be one of the most traumatizing things. I'm not saying that everybody in care has this experience. I'm sure a minority are very lucky and have good foster families, for example, or are adopted at some point, and maybe life works out for them. But the truth is, statistically, they are the minority.
Yeah. So wanting to become a barrister, and how did you get into now you're a KC, right? So where did it start from?
Well, it started for me. I went to a sort of comprehensive school in Milton Keynes, which was at the time in the 1980s wasn't a great school.
Yeah.
It was underfunded, and there were lots of teacher strikes. Ironically, they go through another period of teacher strikes now, of course. But there were lots of strikes, and there was lots of discontent amongst teachers and bad morale in the teaching profession. So I didn't have a sort of great education up to the age of 16. I kind of got through my GCSEs, but nothing spectacular there. But it was a series of events that kind of eventually led me to becoming a barrister, which were, first of all, I left home at 16, went off to try and make money by selling donuts on cans of Coke on the beaches.
So you've always been entrepreneurial,
south of France, right? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I'd worked. I'd always had jobs throughout my childhood. Yeah, I worked in a chicken processing plant. I worked as a golf caddy. I worked for my dad on building sites when he was working on building sites when I was a kid. So I did worked in an ice cream parlour. So I always kind of worked hard and did stuff to make money, even from the age of 10, 11 onwards. Milk rounds, paper rounds, like any job that was going that I could do. So I had all of that, and then I went off to make my fortune as a donut seller. And unfortunately, it didn't work out too well because of, I was 16 and I wasn't really, it was hot weather, and actually the season only lasts 2 months, so what was I going to do the rest of the year? So I ended up coming back, and when I came back, my parents had moved from Milton Keynes up to the northwest, and they'd moved to a small town called Southport on the northwest coast, just north of Liverpool, an old kind of tourist resort. And so I had a choice. I either went to college or got a job, and thankfully for me, looking back on it, I went to the local sixth form college and did really well there. Enjoyed it. Had education that was really penetrating my brain for the first time. And then at about halfway through my A-levels, I went to the careers centre where you had a careers teacher. I don't know if they still have these, but kind of talked to you about what you wanted to do for a job and where you might want to go to university, that kind of thing.
Gives you options, right?
Yeah, give you options. And so and I filled in a computer-based questionnaire and as to the things I liked, didn't like, and it came back and basically said you can either be a barrister or an actor. And so acting, I quite enjoyed doing it, student stuff, but I couldn't really imagine it as a job. But I went off to the Crown Court in Liverpool and sat in the public gallery at the age of 16, 17 and just watched these amazing cases, drugs. I remember I went to see this case involving the defendant had been arrested in the docks at Liverpool, dragging a sack full of heroin out of a container at Liverpool docks. He'd obviously broken into the container. And somehow, miraculously, after the trial, he was found not guilty because his defence was that he didn't know anything about heroin. He just thought he was nicking some watches. And so it's quite an ingenious defence when you think about it, and you're caught red-handed with a bag of smack. But he ran that defence, and his barrister did the most amazing speech at the end about how his client was a professional burglar and he'd never touched drugs in his life, and only in Liverpool perhaps, but it worked. So I watched some of this magic, that these barristers could kind of tell these tales and cross-examine witnesses, and a witness who starts off saying, the moon is made of cheese, the next minute the moon is made of grapefruit, and you've got some of the skills.
It's a skill, isn't it?
Yeah, to turn the course of a trial around with a key sequence of questions, or sometimes it was the closing speech just at the end, where the whole case may have looked really bad for the defendant until the barrister stood up, and then the speech somehow or other ticked certain boxes, and you can see the jury switching on, going, he's got a point. And then they'd come back and say not guilty, and I'd sat and watched the trial and couldn't work out how the magic had happened, what they'd done along the way. So I think it was, and so I became like obsessed with it then. I started reading everything I could about being a barrister, and I came back to my sixth form college and then applied to do a law degree. So
that was your entry point, right?
Entry point was the questionnaire, the computer questionnaire. Without that, I don't think I'd be here now.
Do you think there's a lot of psychology words included when the barristers are cross-examining?
I think psychology. Someone asked me this recently. What's the most important sort of skill, if you like, for a barrister to have? And I think in my line of work, at least in criminal work, it's the ability to understand what makes people tick. So it's your ability to understand the psychology of everybody involved, your own client and what that makes them tick.
So there is awareness, right?
The witnesses, exactly. What's making the judge tick, what's making the prosecutor on the other side, working out everyone's motivations and then finding a way to navigate that and tilt things in your direction.
But how would you learn that though?
I think partly you learn it from experience. So I've been doing the job for 30 years.
Right.
So I've done hundreds of trials. I've seen every possible scenario you can think of played out in court. I've had the most, extraordinary conversations, as you can imagine, with clients over the years who have done all sorts of things, or they haven't done all sorts of things, or whatever it may be. So I think it's experience, but I think some people, and I think I'm one of them, are quite attuned to what makes people tick, and actually quite empathetic. So quite good at reading people, and some people have that naturally, and I think I'm lucky enough to have that as a natural ability.
Interesting.
And I think if you have that ability, it actually is an extraordinarily powerful tool in any walk of life.
You're right.
If you think about if you're in business or in a large corporation, and or you're setting up a new business trying to win customers, if you can read people and understand what they want, what makes them tick, what their motivations
you're just going to go very far.
You can use that information, and you can use it for your own advantage and profit.
100%, I agree. What's the biggest case that you've took on and you kind of you're proud of?
Well, it's
not proud of, but you've took on.
It's kind of a controversial one, but probably the biggest in terms of the length of time I was involved and the profile of it and so on was the Hillsborough case involving the Hillsborough disaster. And I was involved acting for some of the police officers who investigated the Hillsborough disaster.
You was involved in the Hillsborough disaster?
Yes, okay, exactly.
Okay.
So I was involved. There was a big set of inquests in 2014, 15, 16, and then there was a criminal prosecution, and I was defending some of the police officers in that case. And that, again, the whole case went on for about 6 years. There's a huge amount of publicity. And in the end, my client was a retired police officer who'd been accused of all sorts of misconduct. And the case was thrown out by the judge. He just said there's no evidence whatsoever that this man committed any crime. And he was, by that stage, my client was 81 years of age. So it was although it's a case that's incredibly controversial, and lots of people will feel that there was an injustice about the outcome of that case, it's a case that I think really demonstrated why it's so important to have independent defence lawyers who are not kind of required to act on the basis of public opinion or political pressure, but just do our job to uphold our clients' legal rights in court, regardless of what they're accused of, regardless of what the public may make of them or think of them. I acted for John Terry, the former England football captain, Chelsea captain, when he was on trial for another high-profile case 10 or 11 years ago. And again, that case, he was found not guilty, and that was a case where I think that a lot of people, the public mood, if you like, may have been one way, and the court verdict went the other. So I think cases like that, which are in the news and they're kind of high-profile, that have a lots of public interest, but where the outcome is one that I think most people wouldn't necessarily expect. I think those are cases that I get a lot of satisfaction from, because even though they may make me unpopular in some ways, in some quarters, they demonstrate why you need people like me to be there to stand up for those that perhaps don't get much public sympathy, and to make sure that justice is done in the courtroom where it should be done, rather than in the media and on the internet.
So John Terry, the former Chelsea player and the former England player, what was he involved in? What was it?
He was charged with racially aggravated public order offence during a match back in the match was, I think, in 2010 or 11, and the trial was in 2012, I believe.
Yeah.
So about 10 years or so ago, and and that was during a Premier League match, so it was quite a high-profile thing, and he was charged with that. But that case was tried in the magistrates' court because it wasn't. Criminally, it wasn't a particularly serious charge, but it was such a high-profile case.
It was a high-profile case, yeah.
That it played out every minute. I mean, I think it was one of the very first criminal trials to have to be live tweeted from the court. So every word being tweeted by the media and run on Sky News and that kind of thing. Whereas in the past, they hadn't allowed tweeting or any of that to happen. So it's one of the very first cases where tweeting was allowed in court.
Interesting.
Or it just come in around that time, and it was certainly the most high-profile case of its kind at the time.
Interesting. Yeah. So Chris, what's the biggest challenges you've faced personally, or as a business, or just in life generally?
It's quite a big question. As I say, I think coming from what we would call in the law maybe a non-traditional background. So. Traditional background in the law would be privately educated, would be usually having sort of parents or close family friends who are already barristers and can make introductions and can sort of ease the path for you. So I think whether that was as much of a challenge, in reality than it was in my head, it certainly felt like it. But in the end, of course, it wasn't an impediment to my joining the profession or succeeding in the profession. So I think that there's an element of imposter syndrome. I think from anyone that comes from a background that isn't that traditional, kind of very perhaps wealthier and more certainly privately educated. I think lots of us who come from that kind of background find it a little difficult to believe that they'll let us in. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But that's in your own head, I think, as much as anything. And I think even though to this day I don't think I've still fully accepted that they let me into the profession.
I was going to say that, because what are the challenges you're facing now, bearing in mind you're super successful?
Yeah, I think the challenge now is managing my own time, really, because I have so many different commitments. I've got a family, I've got a number of different activities that I do. You mentioned the book that I do a lot of writing. I do lots of media appearances. I'm involved in television, documentary work, and in some drama sort of production. So, as well as a very, very busy caseload across lots of different cases. Sometimes international cases that involve me travelling abroad to see clients or to speak to people involved in cases. So I think the hardest challenge for me now is it's a challenge that I guess many people come across in when they've gone over their sort of startup phase, which for me was quite some years ago. Once you get through that, and if you're enjoying a measure of success, I think the hardest part actually is how to divide your time up between different responsibilities, and that can be tricky. But you have to have a good team of people. You have to make sure that you can delegate. All the cases I'm involved in, there are a range of lawyers of different levels working beneath me or alongside me. Mostly I'm kind of directing and leading the cases, often alongside a very experienced senior solicitor. But we'll have a team. I think one of the ways I navigate that is increasingly through the power of delegation. I think once you realise that you don't have to do everything yourself, it makes life much easier.
I think soon as you know you can outsource, you should just outsource, right?
Yeah.
It helps you grow and gives you a bit more.
You should. I think it's really important, though. Particularly, people come to me because they expect me to lead the case, and they expect me to be in charge.
Yeah.
So there is a danger that you can sort of be seen to have abandoned the client and let everybody else do all the work, and then just come in at the last minute. That's not what I'm advocating. Any more than I think in any other business that leaders can just let other people do the work and not pay attention to it.
Yeah.
It's a question of how you divide your own time up and what you use it for.
Yeah.
So I use my time for this. Most of my time is spent on the higher level strategic decision making, on the key advocacy in court, the key witnesses, the key moments in the trial, and I try as much as I can just to have more of an oversight role in everything else, because otherwise I just wouldn't have time to do everything. Because some of my cases have millions of pages of documents. So as you can imagine, it's physically impossible for one person to read all that anyway. So you have to have a team. So the question then becomes, what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to take a mass of information, a large amount of material, and let other people filter that down so that what I look at is the most important part. Otherwise, I would only do one case at a time. And some of I mentioned the Hillsborough case. I mean, if I'd had to do all the work and read everything on that, it would have taken me 40 years. So it's just physically impossible. So so you have to have this ability, and it's I think, and the transition. So we call anyone who's not a KC, we call a junior barrister. It doesn't matter how old they are; they could be 70.
So you call them just junior barristers?
But that's just the terminology for all. So barristers are split into junior barristers and leading counsel. And leading counsel are now King's Counsel. Junior barristers is everyone else. So it's not about age. So you can have a 70-year-old junior barrister because they've never been made a KC, and that's, in fact, most people are not. So I think having junior barristers that you can trust to do a good job is really important. But as I transitioned from being junior to being KC 10 years ago, coming with that transition is the absolute necessity to be. The reason we're called leading counsel is because we're leading the team. We're not doing everything ourselves. So learning that skill of delegation, learning what you can delegate and what you can't, is I think probably one of the most important things for anyone who's transitioning in a career from a sort of more junior role to a more senior supervisory leading role or an entrepreneurial role is realizing and also not expecting everybody on the team to do it the way you would do it. I think some people I've seen, whether it's in the law or in business, they're unhappy because they complain, well, why aren't they in the office on a Sunday afternoon like I am? Well, if you're the owner of the business, then and they're getting paid, 20 grand a year, it's highly unlikely they're not going to work the same way you do, and they're going to work differently. So you have to accept that not everybody is going to work exactly the same way you do at the same pace and for the same number of hours a day. And once you accept that, the mission becomes not to make everybody in your own image, but to get the best out of everybody, whatever that is, and whatever that looks like. And in some cases that might be that you do need people to put in hours, in the evenings and weekends, but actually you don't always need that. And sometimes, and frankly, you don't always need to be doing that yourself.
Yeah,
my experience. And pushing yourself, as many people in business do, and many people in my line of work push themselves beyond the point at which they can function efficiently. They're too tired, they burn out, maybe even start to develop, mental health issues and such like. So it's managing your own kind of time, managing other people's time, but doing it in a way that's efficient and practical rather than just to some very preset agenda that you think everybody has to do. I think people often, I've seen this myself, I probably was of the camp back in my 20s and early 30s certainly, that believe that, unless you were relentlessly working flat out 7 days a week, you weren't really working.
Yeah, that's not.
And that's not actually true.
No.
And it's not necessarily efficient.
No.
Sometimes it's essential because you've got no other choice because the amount of work that there is in front of you. But you shouldn't, in my view, make that your lifestyle.
No.
Because it won't, in the long run, it won't serve you well.
Yeah, I think you just have to have seasons of what you need to do.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And be able to, even if you can take an isolated break in the middle of a long and busy day, that break will probably do you a lot more good than harm.
Only going to serve you good, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you spent any money on mentors and coaches and personal development? Any?
The only time that I've spent money on that sort of thing was when I was applying to take Silk, as we call it, when I became what was then a QC. Is that I paid a consultant to kind of help me and coach me through the process. So someone who's very experienced in the application process and who had a consultancy advising people who are applying. So, and I think that was a wise move because I acknowledged that whilst I might be an expert at being a lawyer and do my day job, I wasn't an expert at an application process like that. I'd never been through one before. So I think that was really quite important to acknowledge that I
self-aware, right?
Self-aware. I knew what I did know, but I also knew what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know how to navigate that process. So I paid someone to help me with the bits of it that I didn't fully understand. And I was successful in my first application, and many people are not. Many people apply once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times.
Interesting.
Or even more. I've known people to apply 7 or 8 times.
Yeah.
So that was good money well spent. I'm a big fan of spending money on expertise where you don't have it. Yeah, I think that's a really important lesson. And
totally agree.
It's a false economy not to do so in most cases.
Yeah. You mentioned mental health. What's your thoughts on that, and how big of a problem do you think it is, and do you think a lot of people are talking about it enough or not?
I think people are talking about it a lot now, a lot more than they used to. We've seen very high-profile people in the royal family and elsewhere who have talked about mental health as an issue a lot. What I'm not seeing is any evidence.
Who in the royal family?
Well, Prince Harry and Prince William have talked about mental health and struggles with mental health and have campaigned on behalf of mental health charities. And I think lots of public figures and celebrities,
Tyson Fury,
Kanye West, various very high-profile people have been sort of publicly acknowledged their own struggles with mental health problems. But
where do you think it stems from then?
Where do I think what stems from?
The mental health
I think
issue.
Mental health is a combination of 2 things. One is hereditary. Mental health issues run in families. Particularly the more severe conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar tend to run in families, and they run down the family line, either on the male side or on the female side, or sometimes both. So it's definitely, there's geneticism involved, but also there are situational depressions caused by lifestyle, caused by addictions, for example, which so you can have someone who an addiction is of itself, of course, a mental health problem, but that addiction may then lead on to other mental health problems, depression and other forms of anxiety disorder and different things. So I think it's a combination of the genetic and the, as with most things, it's that which is within us and that which we experience in life. And we talked about people in care earlier on. I suspect and I'm very confident of this, that going through the care system is probably a very big predictor of likely mental health problems in later life.
Yeah.
Because of the impact of childhood being so significant on people's later mental health, and that.
So what should someone do if they're suffering from, a few things? How should they like reduce that?
I think the only answer, if someone's feeling they're having mental health problems, the only answer in the end is I'm not talking about there are depressions and mental illness at the milder end of the scale. There can be very severe depressions which are potentially fatal in terms of suicide risk and other things. But there are probably a relatively small number of mental health conditions where people can somehow use their own research and maybe self-help and maybe just meditation and that kind of thing to navigate through it without professional help. But I think in the great majority of cases, the only answer is to seek professional help, to get, speak to a GP. GPs are amazingly well trained now in terms of recognising the need. Yeah, much more so than they ever were. Yeah,
right, okay.
So GPs are certainly much more attuned to mental health difficulties, partly because of the sheer number of patients that they see coming into their surgeries with reporting depression in particular, but also anxiety and various other mental health disorders. And so I think I think the answer is not to be afraid to ask for help. And that if that's a young person initially needing to speak to their parents or to someone that they know, then that's really important. But for adults, I think looking at medical support. I mean, some people are fortunate enough to be able to access private help. Others, sadly, if in the public system, rather like the law, the access to mental health services is extremely restricted, and even for young people and teenagers, it can be very hard to get appointments for months and months, if not years, sometimes. So that's a big problem. It's a big problem as a society. Is that the health service is under enormous strain as it is, and because mental health problems are by definition largely invisible, because they are invisible, they get less attention than cancer and heart attacks, which in essence everybody can really understand and relate to, whereas I don't think everybody can fully understand just how serious mental health conditions are. When they look at someone who looks on the face of it physically to be okay, I think some people would say, well, they can't be that bad. Those who perhaps don't really understand that mental health is just as serious, and of course mental health is one of the biggest killers of young people that there is. So I think it's talked about a lot, particularly by celebrities now, but I don't think we are providing the resource to deal with the problem.
The correct resources, yeah. So what other businesses are you currently involved in?
Well, at the moment, I'm involved in a couple of startups which are at a point where they're kind of quite commercially sensitive, so I can't really talk about in different fields. I've been involved over the years in financial services, different forms of legal services, so not strictly my day job, but other forms of legal service. I've had successful startups, and exited from those businesses. I've been involved in a number of media projects. I have my own kind of media / production company.
Nice.
So I'm involved in a lot of different businesses. And as I said earlier, I think one of the problems for me is managing all of those different commitments. And it's really, really tricky. I have property. I have a property portfolio. So we have a crossover in our careers at least at that point. But I'm always interested in kind of talking to people who I find interesting, whose story is I can buy into their story, where they've come from, what they're doing now, and where they're going. If those three ingredients kind of all add up for me, then I'll talk to people about playing a role in their businesses.
You make a lot of money. What do you do with it? Like, where do you invest with your money?
Well, as I say, I've got money in property. I've got money in the stock markets and across different sort of categories. I've got money in smaller businesses and startup kind of angel investments. I try and invest in things that I'm interested. So increasingly looking at investing in the media stuff, because that's stuff that I enjoy doing. So TV documentaries, TV drama, that kind of thing.
So what would be your dream production if you wanted to release some sort of not a drama series, some sort of a series in terms of, what would it be?
When I was researching my book, I spent a lot of time traveling around the States, going to prisons and visiting, courtrooms and judges and speaking to people. And I think I'd like to do a documentary about the U.S. justice system.
Really?
I'd like but I'd like to do it in a way that is basically learning the lessons of what they are doing wrong and trying to get across to a British audience that we really don't want to go this way. We don't want to end up the way they are with 2.5 million, or the equivalent in Britain would be, I guess, would be about 600,000.
Have they even got enough prisons to?
Well, yes and no. Yes, they have. They have a vast prison, what they call the prison industrial complex. Much of America's prison system is private. They have private companies providing all the food. It's a huge industry. It's $1 trillion industry. The what I call the city of incarceration in the book. It's a massive industry in the US. And lots of people have got their fingers in that pie commercially, and are making a lot of money. They employ lots of high-priced lobbyists in Washington to keep the system going, and across the states, to keep as many people in prison for as long as possible. And I'd quite like to tell the story of US mass incarceration through English eyes, and look at, really let people see what happens when you give in to the demands that we see every day in the paper. Let's lock these people up forever. Let's throw away the key. Well, they've done that over there for so many people, and their society, I'm afraid, is not a better place for that. And I'd like to do something that really, not just to sort of glamorizes it, because a lot of documentaries kind of glamorize prison, I think, and they make it look like it's, it's almost something that's kind of cool, and as you know better than I do, I don't think there's anything really cool about prison or being in prison, and there's certainly nothing very cool about being in and out of prison your whole life and never really building anything or having a proper relationship with your kids or with your family or anything like that. And I think showing just how America has taken it to what I would call a dystopian future, a future that could be our future. We've got 80,000 in prison now. We've already doubled the number in a generation. Do we really want that 80,000 to be 200 or 300 or 400,000? Because if we carry on like this, that's where we end up. We end up with a prison population the size of the population of Manchester or Birmingham. And that, to me, would be a catastrophic mistake. So I would like to do something in the US, filming in the US.
You'd have to go yourself, though, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Interesting. How do you wind down?
I travel when I can. I love traveling. I travel many parts of the world, and I try and travel both with my kids, sometimes without my kids. I think because if you travel somewhere that's quite different to home,
like a different culture.
It's a different culture. It's a different architecture, different weather, different everything. I think it's one of the ways in which I can, generally speaking, switch off much easier than I can if I'm back in England and things that, I'm on the same time zone and I can easily be contacted. I find it quite hard to switch off, actually. My main hobby, if you like, is cooking. I absolutely love cooking.
Really?
I enjoy cooking more than perhaps any other hobby. And of course, it's something you can do at home every day. It doesn't require a huge amount of equipment or anything like that, other than what you have in your kitchen. So probably the thing I do most days is cook at least one meal from scratch that is, even if it's just boiled eggs, just something that I actually go from start to finish. And I think one of the reasons why cooking is such a good hobby for someone like me is because in my day job, nothing's ever finished. If I have a case that I'm instructed on today, we won't get to trial until 2025 or beyond. But I can get up in the morning, I can go to the shop, I can buy the ingredients, I can come back, I can cook it, we can eat it, and it's done in a day. And there's nothing in my life that works out that way. So cooking, I think, is probably for that reason that I can actually set a sense of achievement of finishing it.
You've done something.
Start and finish something in the same day. Very unusual for me.
Since COVID, is it a massive log back with court cases?
Yeah, absolutely. The backlog has gone to over 60,000 cases. It's gone up by more than 20,000 in the last year, and it's gone up a lot. It was already a very large backlog before COVID. I mean,
really?
Many people don't realise just how big the backlog was, and that has a serious effect in so many different ways. It has a serious effect on people, if you look at both sides of the case, people remaining either on remand or now sometimes for several years before their case gets to trial.
Several years?
Several years. I had a client last summer who'd been on remand for 2 years awaiting trial, and he was found not guilty after 2 years on remand, So
what happens then?
He's released, but he doesn't get those 2 years back. That time is gone, right? And so lots of people are waiting 2 or 3 years or more in custody. a larger number of people are waiting the same sorts of periods or even longer on bail, but still their life's on hold. They don't know what's going to happen. They've got to wait for this case to come up, and it's taking years and years to get to trial. But on the other side of the case, the victims, if you think about someone, sadly it happens all too often, but someone who's been raped, they literally, nowadays, there's almost no chance their case will ever get to court, and if it does, they may have to wait again up to 2 years to give evidence about something which was traumatic, when what they should be doing is giving their evidence and then looking at rebuilding their lives and getting some help and therapy or whatever they've been through. So I think the impacts across society of all of that delay are, any victim, not just rape of rape, but of any crime. If you've been the victim of a crime, you've got to wait years to give evidence. You've got to wait years for the outcome. It becomes so disconnected from the event. Of course it does, yeah. And it makes a mockery of what justice is supposed to be for. Yeah. I suppose it goes back to my original point about, the justice system is supposed to reduce crime, reduce the cost of crime, reduce the number of victims. It's not doing that, and delay actually makes it far worse.
What was your thoughts on COVID? My
view at the time, and I haven't changed it, is that the decision to lock down the whole of society, and in particular the decision to lock down children and schools, I think with hindsight was a mistake. At the time I thought it was a mistake. I thought it was inevitable that the impact on a whole generation of young people would be so severe, and we're seeing that now. We talked about mental health, but the mental health problems being faced by what you might call the COVID generation of kids whose education was completely disrupted by lockdowns and the closure of schools, we'll be feeling that damage in that generation for the rest of their lives. So some of them will never sadly recover from it. I think the problem with our approach to COVID, and I think COVID clearly was a very serious problem, particularly with the health service, but the problem with our approach was we failed to acknowledge that only a very small number of people were really at risk, so the elderly and those with underlying health conditions and so on. And instead of effectively recommending that they themselves choose to be locked down, lock themselves down if you like, we chose to lock everybody down. And I think the damage that's done to society, to businesses, and to
kids as well, right?
Kids in particular, to the collective mental health of our younger generation, I think, for me, I think that all of that may have been justified if there were evidence that it would work. But unfortunately, there was no evidence, in my opinion, for any of the lockdown measures that were taken. And they were taken basically off the back of an envelope on the advice of scientists who didn't themselves have the evidence to justify the policy that was being undertaken. Would there have been more deaths without lockdown? The evidence is fairly mixed on that, but possibly yes. But the great majority of those deaths would have been amongst groups who were very unwell, or at least very vulnerable or very elderly anyway. And the consequence of lockdowns for me has been that we've had many more adverse impacts, health-wise, economically and otherwise, on the younger generation. And I don't myself feel that the young should have had to pay the price for those policies.
Yeah. Do you think that there could be another lockdown in future?
I think well, there could be. But I doubt whether it will be in response to the sort of virus that COVID is. If it happens again, I think it would be for something like some form of plague or infection or virus that literally drops people, the Black Death did.
Has that ever happened?
Well, it happened in the 12th century, the Black Death, but wiped out 50% of the population of London in one go. Yeah, and 40% of the population of Britain and most of Europe. But that was a virus spread by rats at a time, the bubonic plague, at a time when there was no medicine. So we didn't have any form of modern medicine. So that was why there were so many people died. But if we had an incurable virus that could almost inevitably kill everybody that it came into contact with, then I'm sure there'd be a lockdown, and quite rightly so, because the evidence would be clear that without it, we'd lose half the population. Yeah. But for an infection that only kills those who are already significantly vulnerable due to age or otherwise, I can't see a lockdown for an equivalent of that again. I don't think people would accept it. Yeah. And I don't think.
Do you think though? I think people will.
Well, I know what you're saying. I think people did accept it, but they accepted it for all the wrong reasons. They accepted it because they believed what they were being told by Boris Johnson at the time and by the other government spokespeople, and they were wrong to believe it because they were not being told the truth.
Interesting. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. How can people reach out to you? Because you are a KC, and what we'll do is also put your book in the description below so people can buy it. And just your last words before we finish off.
Well, firstly, thanks for having me on. It's been very interesting. There's been really good questions, and it's very good to see someone like yourself who's come through, the criminal justice system and come out of it the right way, rather than sadly, if so many people you must have seen and know yourself, that never happens. They literally never get out of it. So it's a pleasure to meet someone who's been through that experience and come out of it in the way that you have. But if people want to kind of follow what I do, they can follow me on Twitter at CrimLawUK. They can follow me on YouTube. That's just my YouTube channel. It's Chris Daw. I think it might still be QC YouTube channel. I'm not sure
Change
it's
that,
been changed yet, but yeah, we'll need to change it if it hasn't been changed. And they can also follow me on LinkedIn, which again, just search Chris Daw KC and you'll find me on LinkedIn. And people who ever listen to the radio or the television, they'll see me pop up now and again. And if anyone has the misfortune to need my legal services, they can get in touch with me again. You can find out my chambers over at Lincoln House in Manchester, Millennium Chambers.
I've heard of Lincoln House in Manchester. I think they represented me as well.
Okay, well there you go. It's a small world, but yeah, I'm not difficult to find with a Google search.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.